Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Vav of Masechta Yoma, Daf 56. The first part of the Daf continues our discussion from yesterday regarding the Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about marking things, about writing on things, whether it is the boxes for the money of the birds or whether it is the stands that the blood is put on in the Kodesh HaKodashim. That gets into, of course, the sugya of Breira. We're going to see some Gemaras that we saw it way back when in Masechta Eruvin. Some interesting Gemaras over there. Then at the end, we're going to wrap up with sprinkling of the blood on the Paroches. So, great daf, Chevra. Let us jump in. We are going to start on daf Nun Amud Beis. 4 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda leis lebreira minola. Okay, so what are we talking about? Who could tell me what we're talking about? Fine. We are talking about, that's exactly correct. That there were these boxes in the Beis HaMikdash, and you could put money in the boxes, and depending on what the box was for, so there were 2 boxes that were related to bird offerings. And Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that these boxes for the bird offerings were only, what are those called? Nidavas, meaning chovas and nidavas, obligatory, and, what's the opposite of obligatory? Voluntary, right? They're only for voluntary offerings. They couldn't be for obligatory offerings, because the obligatory offerings include a chatas, right? 1 chatas and 1 ola. And and we have to be concerned that you have a whole bunch of people putting money in the box, and if one person dies, and we know that this person died, then we know that some of the money in the box is for a person who's no longer alive, and the halacha is a chatas shemesu ba'aleh, that a korban chatas that the owners died. So lemisa azla, or in this case when it's just money, you have to throw the money in the Dead Sea, right? It goes in the garbage. So what do we do about it? So the Gemara suggested, well, why don't we just take out 4 zuz, which is the equivalent of a bird, and throw it in the garbage, and we'll say that those 4 zuz represent the money of this person who died, and then we could offer the rest of the birds for everybody else. Now that would be implementing. That would be where's my vocabulary, man? Whatever. That would be exercising maybe the halacha of breira, which means that we're doing something now to go back retroactively and say something. Meaning, or like in the past we've used the analogy of Photoshop, meaning we're saying right now we're going to take 4 zuz, and then we're going to say that memela retroactively, the mafreya, these were the 4 zuz that this fellow put in initially. So we said that the reason why that will not work for Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, none of the boxes were for obligatory offerings, and it won't work to just take 4 zuz and throw them in the garbage and say that it belonged to the person who passed away, is because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold a breira. He doesn't, he says, look, you can't just do that. You can't just Photoshop. You can't just go back retroactively and say, that these 4 zuz that I'm separating now are actually the 4 zuz that the fellow who died put in originally. Who says? And so now the Gemara wants to know, how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that we do not say breira. Ilema meha ditnan. So if we say it's from the following Mishnah, and we've seen this in Masechta Eruvin, and we're going to see the follow-up Gemara in Masechta Eruvin. Halokech yain mibin akusim. Skip the next 4 words. If a fellow purchases wine from kusim, now of course the kusim, they were people that we couldn't trust that they separated meiser, and therefore you have to separate on your own. Omeid v'omer, so he stands and he says, Shnei lugan shani also la'afresh harei in truma asara meiser rishon tisha meiser sheni. So, interesting why he's separating truma because they were only suspect on the Meiser. But anyways, so you have a fellow, he basically buys wine, and he's going to have to separate tithes. Now, he doesn't have kalim with him. He doesn't have vessels to separate the tithes into this second. So what he says is, look, when I get home, I'm going to be separating truma and Meiser and all that stuff. But I want to drink from the wine right now. So he says, look, when I get home, I'm going to be separating truma. So he stipulates right now that whatever he's going to separate in the future, so let that be considered like it's already separated now. And therefore, memele, anything that he drinks now is from the part that he's allowed to drink, right? So therefore, let's say he got, 100 loaves of wine or whatever it might be. So, let's say 100 ounces of wine. So he says, look, in the future I'm going to be setting aside 2 ounces for truma, 10 ounces for my Rishon, another 9 ounces for my Sheni. So that's a total of what? That's a total of 21 ounces, I think. 10 and 9 and 2. So, which means that 79 ounces he's allowed to drink. So he says, look, I'm going to drink some wine right now. And in the future, I'm going to be separating whatever tithes I'm going to be separating. So let's just say that whatever I separate in the future is ki'ilu, is separated already now, which means that memele, whatever I'm drinking from, is the part that I'm allowed to be drinking from. Right? So he says, Shnei lugin shani osed lahafrish arei in truma. So the 2 loaves that in the future I'm going to be separating, those are, whatever I end up memele separating in the future are going to be truma. Asar meiser rishon, the 10 loaves that in the future I'm going to separate as meiser. So whatever I separate in the future, those are really, from this point already, considered to be the 10 loaves that are shaykh to meiser. Tisha meiser sheni, and then the 9 loaves that will be in the future separated as meiser sheni. Umeichel, and then those 9 loaves you can already now transfer onto money, because of course meiser sheni you could transfer onto money, and then bring the money to the Beis HaMikdash. So whatever he could do at this point, so he might not have vessels right now to transfer the meiser physically into, but he's got some money. He just paid whatever he paid for it, so he could transfer it. He knows how much the wine is worth, and he separates 9 parts and puts that and transfers its value onto money. And Reb Meir says, okay, and once he's done this, he could drink it immediately. So Reb Meir has no problem saying that whatever he's going to be doing in the future, we could count already retroactively, which means that memele, whatever wine he's drinking now, is wine that he's allowed to be drinking. And whatever he separates later is what was really meant to be initially the truma and meiser. Reb Yehuda, Reb Yosef, Reb Shimon Osin. Whereas Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, and Reb Shimon say, this ain't gonna work. And the Gemara wants to assume Ama ein Breira, that it must be that Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, and Reb Shimon don't hold a Breira. They say you can't just retroactively determine things. You can't just say that whatever you're going to separate in the future, we could tie in and plug in retroactively to say that memele, whatever he drank, was allowed to be drank. So we see that Reb Yehuda does not hold a Breira, and therefore tying it back into the birds and the money. So if you have this box, if you would theoretically have a box full of money that is meant to be used for obligatory bird offerings, which consist of 1 chatas and 1 ola, well then in the event that one of the people who put the money in the box dies, which means that some of the money in the box is for somebody who's now dead, and that money needs to be thrown in the garbage. So there's really no way, according to Rabbi Yehuda, to remedy that situation, because you cannot just take out 4 zuz and say, okay, memele, these are the 4 zuz that the fellow who passed away put in initially. You can't just do that. Mimai. Frakti Gemara, who says what? Who says that the reason why Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, and Reb Shimon say that you cannot just separate these tithes right now and drink the wine? Who says that it's because of Breira? Maybe it has nothing to do with Breira. We actually have their reason. What's their reason? They said to Reb Meir, aha. So Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon, and Reb Yehuda, there's nothing to do with Breira, it has to do with a practical concern. They say, Reb Meir, what would happen if the wine skin that it's in, where the container that the wine is in, what if it breaks? So Kilu, you just said, okay, in the future I'm going to separate tithes. And based on the fact that in the future you're going to separate tithes, you're now drinking wine right now, well, you're shtickle taking a risk. Because what happens if the container of the wine breaks, which means that you never had the opportunity in the future to separate the tithes, which means that all you're left with is the fact that you drank wine that was never tithed and is never going to be tithed because the thing broke and all the wine spilled on the floor and is done. And therefore, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon, and Reb Yehuda say, look, you cannot, even if we want to hold a Breira, you still cannot practically drink this wine right now because we have to be concerned that what if the container breaks and you'll never have the opportunity to actually separate the tithes, in which case all you're doing is you're just drinking, if that happens, then you're just drinking tevel, and that's a problem. Ve'amar lahem lichsheibaka. I love it. I loved it when we learned it in Eruvin. I love it now. Reb Meir says, look, I'll worry about it when it happens. When it cracks, when it splits, I'll worry about that. But right now, the container is in good shape. I have no reason to assume that it's going to break. And therefore, says Reb Meir, I'm happy to suggest that this person who purchased the wine could separate whatever tithes he needs to right now and drink the wine. Gewaldig. But what do we see? So we see that it's not necessarily a proof that Reb Yehuda does not hold of Breira. Could be that he does hold of Breira. He's just concerned that the container is going to break. Elo midetani Eyo. Chavi, remember Eyo? From the Aflam and Vav Medbeis of Masechta Eruvin? Who can tell me what Eyo said? Who's got that memory? Who's got that memory? Who can tell me what Eyo said? The Tani Eyo, that Eyo taught Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, the Masna Shnei Dvarim Ke'echad. Chavi, y'all remember this. Elim B'chacham L'Mizrach, Eruva L'Mizrach. Oh my goodness gracious. Eruve Tchumen. Oh my goodness gracious. In B'chacham L'Mizrach, Eruva L'Mizrach, L'Mayrav, Eruva L'Mayrav, Avalachan L'Chan Lo. Oh my goodness gracious. Who wants to explain this Gemara? You have a fellow, he lives in a city. Let's say he lives in city B. And to his right is city C. And to his left is city A. And each one is 2,000 amos away from each other. And therefore, or is it 4,000 amos? No, really 4,000 amos probably, right? Or slightly less, whatever it might be. Oh gosh, all the details of Eruvin. Let's just keep things simple. Basically, he lives in the middle, and he wants to be able to travel either to city C or to city A on Shabbos, depending on where the rabbi is going to be. But he doesn't know in advance where the rabbi is going to be, so he puts out 2 Eruve Tchumen so that he'll be able to travel to either city C or city A. And he figures he'll decide on Shabbos, he'll decide the next day which one he wants to go to. And then Memela will say, Breira will say, whichever he decides on Shabbos day, if he lives in city B in the middle, if he decides on Shabbos the next day that he wants to go to city A, so we'll say city A, okay, Beseder. So we'll say that retroactively at Ben Hashmashos on Friday, when the Erev kicks in, when it's Konish Visa, when it acquires resting. So if on Shabbos day he decides that he wants to go to city A, we'll go back retroactively and say that when Shabbos came in, it was the Erev in between his city and city A that was effective. That was Kona Shvisa, and the one between city B and C was irrelevant. So, says Ayo, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, Ein Adam Masna Shnei Dvarim Ke'echad. A person cannot make a condition, a stipulation on two things at the same time. El in Bachacham leMizrach, Eruvo leMizrach. Rather, what the stipulation has to be is that if the rabbi is going to be in the city on the east, so in our case, city C, so then he's going to rely on the Erev between his city and city C. L'mayrav Ruvo L'mayrav, if the rabbi is going to be in the west, in city A, so then it's going to be the Erev between his city and city A. That is Kona Shvisa. Avalachan u'lachan lo. But if he's not sure, right, or let's say there's two rabbis, one's going to be in city C, one's going to be in city A, and he just wants to say, look, the next day I'll decide whichever one I feel like going to, that won't work. You can't have two Erevs that you're relying on, only one. Ve'avinan, but we ask, my shna, l'chan u'l'chan delo. What's the difference? The ein breira, is it because we say that there's no breira? Is it because, so we're saying that if he wants to just be able to decide the next day whether he wants to go to city A or city C, that doesn't work. Why? So the reason why it doesn't work is because ein breira. You can't just decide the next day. I want to go to city A, so then therefore Memela retroactively when Shabbos came in, it was the Erev between his city and city A that was Kona Shvisa. You can't do that. Well, if that's the case, Lemizrach U'Ma'ariv Nami ein breira. So then, practically speaking, what's the difference between, if there's going to be a rabbi in city A and a rabbi in city C, and we say that he's not allowed to wake up the next day and decide at that point which rabbi he wants to go to. And we're saying because we can't retroactively go back and say that when Shabbos started, it was the Erev that he's deciding now that he wants to take advantage of, which was Kona Shvisa yesterday. Well, if that's the case, then even when it's only one rabbi, and he's just not sure which city he's going to be in. As Rashi points out, let's say when Ben Hashmosha starts, the rabbi didn't yet arrive at either city, and he's smack in the middle, and we don't know, is he going to go to city A, is he going to go to city B, is he going to go to city C, and therefore, we seem to be saying it's no problem for him the next day to decide, based on where the rabbi ended up going, which Erev he's going to rely on to get to the city where the rabbi is. Who cares? We're still going to say ein breira. When Shabbos came in, one of them had to be Kona Shvisa, and he didn't yet know which one was going to be Kona Shvisa because the rabbi wasn't yet at either city. He only knows after the fact, once the rabbi actually went to one of the cities, which means that the next day he's going to be going in and saying that when Shabbos started, it was the Erev that he needs to rely on now to get to the rabbi that was Kona Shvisa, but it's the same breira. So, Ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan k'shekvar b'chacham. And Rabbi Yochanan answers, the difference is it's talking about where the rabbi had already arrived at the city, and he just didn't know which city it was. So, Kilu Memele, the rabbi was already, let's say, in city C, which means that he already knew when Shabbos started that he was going to be going wherever the rabbi was. The rabbi was already in city C, he just didn't yet know that the rabbi was in city C. But therefore, Memele, when Shabbos started, it was we don't have to go back retroactively and say that, oh, this is the one. No, but when Shabbos already started, the rabbi was already in city C, and Memele, it was this Erev between city B and city C. That was Kona Shvisa. We don't have to go back based on some variable that changed on Shabbos and plug it in. Right? Keilu, already when Shabbos started, it's the Erev that was between where he lives and where the rabbi is. That was Kona Shvisa, and that is that. But if the rabbi was not yet at the city, at city C when Shabbos began, let's say he was halfway, right? In such a way that he could have traveled either to city A and city C or city C, and if we don't know yet where he's going to go, and we're relying on having to go in after the fact based on the decision of the rabbi and plug in that when Shabbos started, that's the Erev that he wanted to use, that would not be allowed to be done. But if the rabbi was already at city, let's say city C when Shabbos started, but this fellow just didn't know that yet, but still, since the rabbi was already where he was going to be, so Memele when Shabbos started, it was that Erev between his city and where the rabbi is, that was Konesh Fisa, we don't need to rely upon Brera. So what do we see? So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you cannot rely upon Brera. You have to know when Shabbos started which city you're going to be going to, even if you yourself don't know, but all the facts were already on the ground when Shabbos started. You know that you're going to be relying on whichever Erev will get you to where the rabbi is. The rabbi was already where he's going to be. All the facts were already on the ground. You only just needed to find out where he was, but Memele, that Erev could be Konesh Visa. So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you cannot say Brera, and that is why when it comes to the birds and the money and the collection boxes, Rabbi Yehuda says there were no collection boxes for obligatory offerings because one of those birds is going to have to be a chatas, and in the event that one of the owners of one of the birds dies, well, there will be no way to remedy that, and therefore no obligatory offerings in those boxes. Gemara. Okay, fine. So we've said, fine, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold the Brera, and that's why he says what he says when it comes to the boxes. But he does hold of writing. If you remember yesterday, in the context of the boxes in the Beis Hamikdash, Rabbi Yehuda had said that there are 13 boxes, and you taka write on each of the boxes what the box is for. So Rabbi Yehuda does hold that labeling is a completely legitimate activity to do in the Beis Hamikdash. You're allowed to label things and therefore assume that people put things in the correctly labeled box in this case. So then, why don't you Yoma Kippurim nami naivid trei v'nichtov alayu? So then on Yom Kippur, let's say the same thing. There were two stands in the Heichel. At least according to the Chacham, there were two stands. On one of them, he would put the blood of the cow. On the other one, he would put the blood of the goat. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, there was only one stand, because we want to make sure that the Kohen Gadol wouldn't mix anything up. So there was only one stand, and therefore he would pick up the blood of the cow before putting down the blood of the goat, and that way he would always know that he's only dealing with one thing at any given time. There aren't any two stands where he can mix things up. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, if he's saying that you're allowed to label things, so why don't you just have two stands and label them? This is for the cow, this is for the goat, and then he won't make any mistakes, because we're allowed to rely upon labeling, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And for the Gemara answers, Mishum chulsha de Kohen Gadol avadaite. So, as we've seen kind of a theme a number of times, that we have to be concerned about the Kohen Gadol getting tired. He's not eating, he's got a lot of work to do, he may not be paying attention to the labels. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, labels in this case will not work, and it's better to just have one stand where you know, almost objectively, that he's only ever going to be dealing with one thing. He swaps out the goat blood for the cow blood, and now he knows that he's dealing with the cow blood. There's less of an opportunity for things to get mixed up. The ilote machi, because if we're not concerned about, if you don't say like this, i.e., that we have to be concerned about the Kohen Gadol getting tired and not paying attention, below ksivanami, I novish vayzuter. Forget about writing. Even without the writing, there's a lot more blood in a cow than there is in a goat. And therefore, I should assume that even without writing, shouldn't the Kohen Gadol realize, wow, there's a lot more blood, that must be the cow? And if you're going to say, well, what if he doesn't accept all the blood? And therefore, if you receive less of the blood in the vessel, well then, they can end up being the same amount of blood. But Ve'amar Yehuda, Rav Yehuda says that you have to receive all of the blood of the cow, which means that Memela there's going to be a lot more blood than there is going to be cow blood than goat blood. Shenemar, as the Apostle says, Dam apar yishboch that all of the blood of the cow you have to spill on the base of the mizbech after all the work has been done, etc. And therefore, there's going to be a lot more cow's blood. And if you can say, well, yeah, but what if some of the cow's blood spills out and now they're the same amount? But the goat's blood is lighter and the cow's blood is a thicker red. So therefore, even without writing anything on the stands, I should still, I would argue that the Kohen Gadol will be able to tell the difference between the cow's blood and the goat's blood because there's a lot more cow's blood. Or the cow's blood is clearly a darker hue. So rather it must be that even though there's a lot more cow's blood, or even though the shade of the cow's blood is a darker shade of red, nonetheless, we're concerned that he's not paying attention because there's a lot going on. He's not eating. He's got a lot of work to do. He's not paying attention to the color of the blood or how much there is or even the labels. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says just use one stand and make sure that any given time he's only dealing with one vessel of blood. There was a certain fellow who was the Shliach Tzibor in front of Rava, which is interesting because I feel like a lot of times we have Ha'udanachis Kame de Rabba. A lot is relative. So I kind of was like expecting that they would change Rava to Rabba, but that's not the case. And this fellow who was the Kohen Gadol this fellow who was the Shliach Tzibor and was, doing the part of the prayer that discusses the Kohen Gadol's Avodah on Yom Kippur. So he says, that the Kohen Gadol left the Kodesh HaKodashim and he put the blood of the goat on the second stand in the Heichel. And then he says that he took the blood of the cow and then put down the blood of the goat. To which Rava said, I don't understand. First you said like the rabbis that there were two stands, but then you said like Rabbi Yehuda that he first takes the blood of the cow before putting down the blood of the goat. Which is like Rabbi Yehuda who says that there's only one stand and therefore he had to pick up the blood of the cow before putting down the blood of the goat. So rather, I'll say, no, he put down the blood of the goat on the second stand and then picked up the blood of the cow. Okay. And then after the sprinkling of the blood of the cow and the goat in the Kodesh HaKodashim, there's then the sprinkling of the cow and the goat, their blood on the paroches, right, on the curtain that divides between the Heichel and the Kodesh HaKodashim. And similarly he will do to the tent of meeting. How come it says that? Because it's saying that in the same manner, in the same way that he sprinkles the blood in the Kodesh HaKodashim, he also sprinkles the blood in the Heichel. That just like in the Kodesh HaKodashim, he sprinkles the blood once above and 7 times below with the blood of the cow. That's also what he does in the Heichel. That he sprinkles on the paroches, or before the paroches, from the blood of the cow, 7 above and 1 above and 7 below. And just like in the Kodesh HaKodashim, he sprinkles the blood once above and 7 below of the goat. He does the same thing just like he does that in the Kodesh HaKodashim, he does the same thing in the Heichel by the paroches. That the Eibishter lives among the Yidden even when they are impure. That even b'shas, even at the time that the Yidden are impure, the Eibishter is still among them. There was a certain Nudnik who said to Reb Chanina, Hashta, bari tmei matun. He says, look, Reb Chanina, it's indisputable that right now you are impure. The chsiv, as the pasuk says in Megillas Eicha, tumasa b'shulea, that there was tuma in its midst, in its hems. Everybody's tummy. Omar le, to which Reb Chanina responded, Tachazi maksivbu, but wait, come and see what the pasuk says. Hashochin itam b'soch tumosam, that the Eibishter dwells among us, even in our impurities. Afilu b'zman shein tmein, shchina shruya b'nein, even at the time that the Yidden are impure, the Eibishter is still among us. So this min, he says, look, you're all tameh. Reb Chanina says, yeah, but even when we're tameh, the Eibishter is still with us. Chevre, that was daf nun vav of Masechta Yoma, another gishmake daf over here. We discussed the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda regarding Breira and how that ties in to obligatory bird offerings. We suggested two places where we might be able to learn out Rabbi Yehuda's opinion of Breira. One was from separating, sort of retroactively or in the future, separating Truma and Meiser from wine, although we said that wasn't a proof. However, we did say that the proof was from setting an Eruve Tchumen. Eruve Tchumen, that's been a while. Right, the Rabbi Yehuda says, look, you can only, right, if you're not sure where the rabbi is going to be, if he's going to be to the city to the right or to the city to the left, so then you can only, so the idea was, why don't you just set up an Eruv between both cities, and then later on figure out which one you're going to use. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's only going to work if the rabbi was already in one of the cities when Shabbos began, or at least at Bein Hashmashos, and you just didn't know which one he was at yet, but you wouldn't, if he didn't even arrive yet at the city, and that was a variable when Shabbos began, so you wouldn't be able to later on plug it in with Breira. So we see that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that we do not say Breira, and that is why when it comes to the collection boxes for bird offerings, there cannot be for obligatory offerings, since if one of the owners dies, it'll ruin it for everybody. And you can't just take money and throw it in the garbage and say retroactively that money belonged to the person who passed away. We then said, okay, fine, but Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, which we established yesterday, seems to be that labeling is an effective way of assuming that people are going to put money in the right boxes. So why don't we say the same thing by the stands that the Kohen Gadol puts the blood on Yom Kippur? Why don't we just label one for the goat and one for the cow? How come, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's only one stand so that nobody makes mistakes? Let him just have two and label them. So the Gemara answers that, well, because the Kohen Gadol is very busy and he's not necessarily paying it, he hasn't eaten, he's got a lot of work to do, he may not be paying attention to labels. Therefore, we just use one stand according to Rabbi Yehuda, and the Kohen Gadol is only working with one set of blood at any given time, and it'll be clearer which one it is. And then at the end, we said that just like there's the blood of the cow and the goat, the one above, 7 below, in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the same applies in the Heichal for the sprinkling of the blood and the goat on the Paroches. Chever, that was Daf Nun Vav. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.